This is Christ Questions. Today we're asking, why were the treasures of the first temple still in the Babylonian treasury in the book of Ezra? And as you might imagine, this is less of a faith question and more of an historical exploration, but one I think that is quite valuable. For context, we're looking at Ezra chapter 1, verse 7. The Babylonian exile has been ended by Cyrus the Messiah, king of Persia, and the people of God are collecting the volunteers and wealth that they'll need to return to the Holy Land and rebuild the temple. At which point we hear that Cyrus the king brought forth the vessels of the house of the Lord, which Nebuchadnezzar had brought forth out of Jerusalem, and had put them in the house of his gods. Even these did Cyrus, king of Persia, bring forth. But it's been 50 years since those treasures had been plundered. This was thousands of gold and silver objects, and many folks gloss over this when they're reading or when they're studying. They just simply take for granted that, of course, God preserved the treasures of the temple. And I mean, he did. Don't lose sight of that. But in the workings of history, the details of how it came to pass that this massive treasure was available when so much else had been lost, it's a good place to learn a bit more biblical history. But first, why is it surprising at all that the treasures were still around to be recovered? Well, ancient Mesopotamian governments had two sources of revenue. They took taxes from their people, which was paid mostly in grain and cloth and labor and other basic products, not coins. They didn't have coins, and usually not metal wealth, because the people largely wouldn't have had a lot of metal wealth. It was these basic, directly useful goods. And these taxes funded the logistics of government. They made sure that government soldiers and officials and bureaucrats received their rations in exchange for their services. Usually none of these people would be paid in coins. Again, there were no coins, and they usually wouldn't be paid very much in metal wealth, if at all. They would be paid in food, cloth, and other basic products that they could directly use or very easily exchange in a market for something else that they might want. Now, some of these basic taxation would have been traded to other nations for metal wealth, but most of the surplus was stored in granaries, either to be distributed later or to be stored in case of disaster. Here, remember Joseph's plan back in Egypt, back in the book of Genesis. But this taxation of grain and labor was perishable. It largely needed to be used pretty close to where it was being taxed. And this has resonance in both of the temple constructions, in the books of Kings and Chronicles for the first temple, and here in Ezra Nehemiah for the second. Many modern readers see a great community spirit in the people of Israel, all contributing their talents to the construction of the temple. But you can see the same thing in the customary labor tax common throughout the Middle East. Now, just because it is a tax doesn't mean it has to have been oppressive and miserable. I think a lot of us would be content with our taxation if it was going only to worthy causes and competently administered. It's only when it feeds evil purposes and corruption and bloated mismanagement that the mere fact of taxes becomes onerous. Also, as King Solomon's successors learned, there is such a thing as excessive taxation. In the time of Ezra, the tax level and usage seems to have enjoyed broad popular support. But it's a good lesson that the only actual hint of times of full communal sharing, these don't happen in the Old Testament. These come only in the generation after Christ arrives on the earth. It's never actually modeled in the Old Testament. These temple construction periods, the tabernacle construction periods, often would have been understood by the people in their own times as part of the communal labor tax or corvée labor customary among ancient nations. Anyway, the other income source in the ancient world was plunder. Now, this didn't just come from conquest. Nearly every ancient state would also lead raids against their neighbors just to take their stuff. And this includes the Israelite kingdom, by the way. We think of the kingdom of David as being something close to the borders of modern Israel, and that's approximately what he directly conquered. But the Book of Kings does point out that he led campaigns far outside that region, plundering and demanding submission almost all the way to the Euphrates River. Did you ever stop to think where all those temple treasures originally came from? Or perhaps why was Solomon so wealthy? Trade in luxury goods was only just starting to recover from the absolute nadir of the Bronze Age collapse. By Solomon's time, his kingdom had built up enough that crafts and trade were part of the equation, as would have been the copper mines down in the south, if that was in fact historical. But the Israelites had basically been hill tribes only 2 generations prior. This entire new kingdom of Solomon's was built on conquest and plunder. And so, when Babylon showed up and plundered the temple, they were simply doing what was customary to ancient nations, plundering those who opposed them. Interestingly, had the Ark of the Covenant still been in the temple, it would have been customary for the Babylonians to carry it out of the temple and into the temple of either Marduk or Nabu, two Mesopotamian gods, in order to be venerated there. But in the position as a deity subordinated to the Babylonian gods, which would have been theologically quite an interesting circumstance. So you can probably see why God didn't allow it to happen. The whole question of whether the ark was in fact still there and where it went was too big for today's episode. For sure, the ark probably wasn't there when the Babylonians got there, but there was quite a lot of precious goods within that temple being used for various ritual purposes. But it's important to note that not all of the things in the Jerusalem temple would have been for ritual use. Cyrus recovers 5,400 various items, including 1,000 silver basins. Now I'm going to tell you something, and it may or may not be controversial, but let me tell you, the temple did need some basins for washing and for holding items. But it's hard to imagine a practical use for 1,000 silver basins, and more if you count the gold ones as well. The temple was a treasure storehouse, and at least some, though certainly not all, of that wealth within was, just like all ancient temples, not intended to be used in a regular ritualistic fashion, but it was intended to be slowly sold off to pay for expenses. In the records that we have from ancient Near Eastern temples, funding levels shift radically from generation to generation, as different kings have different amounts of wealth and different priorities, and the economy as a whole affects the temple in various ways. Temples struggle more when the economy is struggling, if you can imagine such a thing. And it really isn't unusual to see even major temples in Near Eastern civilizations digging deep into their reserves for a century or more. And while the evaluations of the Israelite and Judean kings in Scripture are surely based on more than just their degree of temple patronage, it really seems quite likely that temple patronage was part of the grading rubric for how the Bible decides whether or not the individual kings are counted as good or wicked kings. The Jerusalem temple then was wealthy in 587 because there had been a ruler who had patronized it recently, likely Josiah, and probably there was also still some wealth there from the days of Hezekiah, though of course we can't really know that for sure. When that treasure went into the temple treasuries of Babylon, we lose track of it. Daniel tells us that it went into a temple treasury, which most take to be the temple of Marduk, which it may well have been, but it could also have been the temple of Marduk's son Nabu, who was quite popular in that era. Either way, both treasuries and most other Babylonian royal and divine treasuries would have been full to bursting in this era. And that is largely what saved the treasures of the First Temple. You see, treasure income in the ancient world, metal wealth in general, was fairly illiquid. Weights of metals had been used as currency for thousands of years before the first coins were invented. All that talk of shekels in the Old Testament, nearly all of that is talking about a gross weight of metal, not the sort of pre-stamped coin that would become common in the classical era. And yet, while you could, in theory, buy whatever you needed with metals, in practice, there was a limit to your purchases. Ultimately, the great treasure houses of Babylon were stuffed full of more metal wealth than the economy could buy. Every year, many pounds of gold and silver, possibly even tons of it, were melted down and traded at weight or given as gifts. And yet Babylon simply had more metal to use as currency than the towns around them had goods to supply. Inflation was a thing back then, but in the relatively primitive economies of the pre-coinage eras, there were limits, and only one buyer was likely to empty the granaries and run the people into subsistence more likely than they were to cause hyperinflation. And so the treasuries of Babylon literally had more metal wealth than they could spend. And since their nation never went into a protracted period of decline, instead being conquered while still in full flower, unable to spend their great wealth. Which does raise the question of how wealthy they actually were. As all of these vast storehouses of treasure gained through blood never actually gained them anything economically, serving only to inflate their pride and prestige. But ultimately, it was this circumstance that allowed the treasury of the Second Temple to start off decently full. Now, some will tell you that the Babylonians didn't spend their temple treasures because all these treasures were sacred objects. And this is, for the most part, not the case. If the Ark of the Covenant had been taken, and possibly whatever else was in the Holy of Holies, these would have retained a special status to Babylon, likely defiling them in a way that would have prevented their use in the Second Temple, as they probably would have been involved in pagan worship. But even though the great majority of plundered treasures had been, in some sense, consecrated to God, and were later rededicated formally to the Babylonian gods, such consecration was not seen to prohibit their use in secular purposes, as long as those secular purposes are somehow related to the temple. In the ancient world, a silver temple bowl could be put on a shelf as an ornament, or it could be used as a wash basin, or it could be sold to buy cattle for the temple, or it could be desacralized and given to the king as taxes. Or let's be honest here, it could also just have been taken by a corrupt priest for his own personal wealth, though this was, of course, not actually something that was legitimate, just something that kind of sort of happened. It wasn't any sense of consecration that saved the temple treasures, it was the hand of God working through ancient economics. But why do we care about treasure? Now, in a large sense, we kind of don't. Scripture itself only dedicates a few lines to the matter. It's an afterthought in the grander drama of Israel's faithfulness, or lack thereof, to the Lord our God. And yet, in all things, God is working. God wanted the temple rebuilt, and so he secured funding for it. He could have funded the temple in some other way, but he did it in this way, because there are lessons in that history lesson, perspectives and morals that apply beyond this one incident. This is one of the key miracles that converted me, that there is no end to the depths that can be plumbed in his holy word, and the scriptures of Christ really are testaments unlike any other. Let me know what you think about all this in the comments, and definitely tell me, as always, where and if I'm going wrong. Thank you for listening.